Welcome to Root Shock, the show where we ask, what even is health in late-stage capitalism? I'm your host, Hannah Titus. Join me as we explore themes of healing and liberation, centering diverse perspectives and rooting every conversation in cultural, historical, and critical context. This is Story as Medicine, from how we define health to how we do science. Because health isn't just bodies, it's the systems, stories, and power structures that shape them. How far will Big Pharma go to turn a profit? In this episode, we journey to early 2000s Japan, where the pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline invented a disease to sell the cure, changing Japan's cultural relationship with depression in the process. In the autumn of 2000, Dr. Lawrence Kermeyer, who is a famous transcultural psychiatrist at McGill University in Canada, examining psychiatric phenomena through a cultural and cross-cultural lens, he's invited to a special closed-door meeting with GlaxoSmithKline in Japan, where they have gathered a small group of experts, doctors, psychiatrists, and asked them to explain how culture shapes the illness experience, because they're trying to sell a pill. They have developed Paxil, which is an SSRI that's since fallen out of vogue, but in the early 2000s was the new hot girl on the scene. The problem is there's no market for SSRIs in Japan. The Japanese public don't really identify with the Western concept of depression as we understand it. They're generally suspicious of the American propensity to walk around with a big trusting smile on your face, display extroverted traits to complete strangers, and have a perhaps correct suspicion around any drugs, medications, or otherwise that are mood enhancers, which a lot of drugs on the American market were at that time. There is some understanding at this time, of course, of human sadness. Humans are human, and we build cultures around our experience, and these cultures create a reciprocal relationship. In Japan at the time, we have the concept of utsubyo, which is rare, chronic, and severe. This is not your run-of-the-mill mild sadness. It's considered a psychiatric condition that is debilitating. Someone experiencing utsubyo would not be able to hold down a full-time job in any capacity and would have to be supported by their community. But even in cases of deep sadness, the Japanese culture didn't overwhelmingly pathologize these experiences. It's treated as a sort of moral strength, somebody who reflects on the human condition deeply enough is sure to become a little sad. And so since psychiatry is reserved for serious mental illnesses like utsubyo, and deep sadness is not pathologized, but rather understood as a kind of moral strength, medications that cater to the walking worried, the person that is just generally unhappy with life or feels a little rain cloud over them on a regular basis, aren't readily received by the public. But that doesn't make Big Pharma any money. So we have to bring in experts to understand this phenomenon with the hopes of changing it. So Kermeyer comes in with an academic's reserved optimism about the whole process, and he gives a well-founded presentation on explanatory models of disease. Explanatory models help us see how one input or experience can be understood in a person differently based on their cultural context. For example, depression in Korea may be felt as a burning sensation, whereas if you ask an American about depression, it might be explained as like a cold lethargy or heaviness. Similarly, depression can be understood as a sense of loneliness and disconnection. In indigenous populations in the US, it's often described as a sense of loneliness or isolation from land, from people, from purpose. And across cultures, we have these different understandings of what it means to be, quote, depressed or any other emotion that we might feel. So he's putting forth the idea that culture influences which symptoms are noticed by a person and how that suffering is interpreted. In the US, we interpret that mental suffering as cut and dry mental illness. Visit your therapist for talk therapy, visit your psychiatrist for medication, and that's that. Be a responsible person and get your mind under control so you can go back to work, please and thank you. But in many other cultures, Japan included, experiencing sadness was thought to be a normal part of the human condition that is perhaps slightly more permanent than ephemeral happiness and may even have spiritual or moral underpinnings, a reasonable and rational response to encountering the world that is, across cultures, across time, full of injustice, loss, grief. And so just because a Japanese person feels sad, that doesn't mean that they experience that sadness in the same way an American does. And that is what Dr. Kermeyer is trying to explain. Kermeyer says psychiatry is an international subculture that imposes categories that may not fit elsewhere. So GlaxoSmithKline launches an all-encompassing marketing campaign that lasts upwards of a decade. It's a long game scheme to reorganize the public perception of what depression is, moving away from these heavy-hitting, rare pathologies like utsubyo and moving towards something that a broad spectrum of people could experience and seek and obtain treatment for. They exploit rising suicide rates in the country and growing concern about mental health. There is a rising suicide rate in Japan, and there's rising public concern about mental health in general. GlaxoSmithKline jumps in to say, hey, this multifactorial phenomenon, we should be attributing it to untreated depression. That's what it is. That's why people are committing suicide, not because of multitudinous factors of economics, social change, globalization, etc., but untreated depression, a medical phenomenon treatable by our SSRI, Paxil, the superior scientific solution. It's no coincidence that as the imposition of Paxil starts being placed on Japan, there's also a rising sentiment within the scientific community, the doctoring community, and the pharmaceutical offices that Western science is somehow superior to Japanese expressions of medicine and science. And that goes along with the entire marketing campaign that they launch. GlaxoSmithKline starts pushing primary care doctors to use a 3-minute screening tool to ascertain in 3 minutes whether a person has this Western defined disease called depression. And the media campaign is a very important tool that they use to sell this perspective. They use public service announcements. They build websites. They enlist very famous actresses to educate the public, bypassing laws around advertising for a medication by instead saying we're doing the public a service by educating them on this emergent disease, depression, that's insidiously been in every household this whole time. In most other countries, direct-to-consumer advertising of medications is illegal. And in America, we're so inundated with pharmaceutical advertisements, the rapid speech explanation of all the symptoms that might kill you. But, by the way, you should get this drug. And anyway, happy woman on a beach. That we don't realize that that's not the case in many other countries. GlaxoSmithKline is undeterred by this. They can easily bypass these regulations by framing their websites as public interest campaigns, educational campaigns. They create these online quizzes that, similarly to the doctor's questionnaire, can assess via a BuzzFeed-style quiz if you might have depression. They create thinly veiled patient advocacy groups that are secretly funded by the pharmaceutical company, where a person might go to a website that's been algorithmically pushed in the early aughts of the internet by GSK to learn about this disease, thinking that they're speaking to a nonpartisan advocacy group, but really that group is fully funded, that website is fully funded, and all the copy is written by the pharmaceutical company's marketing division. They've renamed utsubyo to kokoro no kaze, which translates to a cold of the soul. A cold can happen to anybody. A cold is ephemeral, and a cold, most importantly, is relatable to everyone and relatively unstigmatized compared to a debilitating and rare psychiatric condition. Sounds mild, sounds relatable, sounds treatable. What they did was rebrand Utsubyo so that depression could be understood as something that everybody could get and everybody could get medication for. So GlaxoSmithKline is able, through their funding, through which things they decide to highlight and which things they decide to ignore, they're able to promote studies that show a favorable effect of their drug, Paxil, and bury the bad ones. And this is pretty critical because some fairly large early trials of SSRIs in Japan failed. They failed to show that SSRIs were effective on a Japanese population. There were plenty of existing studies on American patients that showed SSRIs worked. It's very expensive to run a human clinical trial. You have to run through many different phases of safety in animals before you run safety in people, before you get to dosage, before you get to efficacy. It's a very expensive endeavor. And so the pharmaceutical company doesn't want to invest money in additional studies. They don't want to admit that we should make sure that this chemical that worked in one population, an American audience that was mostly white, mostly male, also works in a Japanese population. And unfortunately, when they did run those trials, they discovered, it doesn't work very well. For whatever reason, the Japanese population just didn't take to them the same way. Unfortunately, by the time these trials were being run, Paxil had already been developed. We're well into the marketing phases of expansion. From a business perspective, we're in too deep to backpedal. It doesn't matter something silly of the science, like if the drug works or not. The drug's already been made, it's been marketed, it's being sold. We're going to make sure that people think it works. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to woo the top researchers, which is very easy to do. Scientists are underpaid, underappreciated. They're very easy to buy off with a glitzy hotel room and a nice meal. And that is what happens when we defund the sciences and punt science over to private industry. So they pay top scientists a whole lot of money to allow them to ghostwrite certain studies. Basically, writing a study according to their narrative and having the scientist with a reputation sign off yes. It's how the game is played. And depending on who you ask, a scientist may or may not have ethical qualms with that process. They gotta eat. Intrinsic to this process was the assertion that Western science was superior in some way, and Japanese science has to catch up, that it's somehow less sophisticated than the Western scientific model. This marketing campaign was wildly successful. It worked so well. Patients started flooding doctors' offices with the pamphlets and advertisements that the company had pushed into their hands, insisting that their depression symptoms be treated right away by their doctor. Antidepressant sales in Japan quintupled between 1998 and 2003, just 5 years. And when Paxil was introduced to the Japanese market in 2000, it took only 1 year on the market to rake in $100 million. In 2005, Paxil held a large portion of the antidepressant market in Japan, taking up about half of the market share. And by 2008, Paxil sales in Japan had brought in $1 billion per year. The whole culture surrounding psychiatry has changed drastically. From a stigmatizing notion that no one talked about, depression has become one of the top concerns of people. It has become a legitimate disease at so many different levels, and at the same time, these changes have transformed the nature of depression as an experience itself. What we can learn from this story is this. Mental health, especially depression, is culturally specific. Being sad is a human condition, but the way that a person embodies depression from the symptoms that they experience to the way that their community then interprets those symptoms and assigns value to them. All of these things are culturally embedded, and they change from place to place. In the aughts of the 2000s, one pharmaceutical company was able to drastically change the landscape of mental health in this country through use of creative marketing and some nudges in the direction of the science, how it was written and how it was conducted. Viewpoints around depression changed, especially how it should be treated. This story highlights the tension between globalized psychiatry and local cultural meanings of mental experiences. And we see here that mental health isn't just something that happens inside of our brains. Yes, it's biological, but it's also cultural, and it's political. And all of this can lead us to wonder, wherever we are in the world, how is my culture that I'm embedded in influencing the way I think and the way that I experience mental and emotional suffering? How do my embodied and somatic experiences change based on the culture I'm embedded in? And more curiously, how can bigger actors like corporations and companies that push things like pharmaceuticals, how do they impact my thoughts and my thoughts about my thoughts? To explore all these questions and more, keep listening to further episodes of Root Shock. Thanks for listening. If this episode fired you up, fuel my ego and the revolution by following, sharing, and leaving a review, because healing is a group project. This episode was produced by Matt Kendrick. Until next time, may you rest, resist, and use your gifts.